Hello, I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights, and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode, Noel Meehan and Eimear Connery from the Teagasc Water Quality team identify key areas in farmyards and land that are vulnerable to nutrient loss and identify mitigation strategies to prevent such loss.
I suppose I would start with the Water Framework Directive, which is an EU piece of legislation which tasks all EU members with having water quality at good status by 2027. And I suppose just to put good status in context, we're all familiar with 4 and 5 star hotels. So good status is 4 or 5 star water quality is what we need, good status or high status. So that's where the target is, and that's what drives all the water quality legislation and work that's going on in Ireland. So I suppose each country can come up with their own plan as to how to do that. So the current plan is the second river basin management plan, and within that, it sets out the parameters how Ireland will achieve or attain good status. And I suppose the second river basin management plan is a lot different to the first one in that they've moved away from the kind of the regulatory approach to the one size fits all approach where one set of regulations are blanket across the whole country to a more collaborative, engaging with the stakeholders approach, and also trying to identify the appropriate measure, the right measure, and put it in the right place, because what works in one place won't work in another. So it's much more nuanced, much more practical approach to trying to improve water quality. And I suppose the reason why I'm saying this is because the second river basin management plan, part of the strategy was to establish two bodies. One is the local authorities waters program, LawPro, and the other was the Agricultural Sustainability Support and Advisory Program, or ASSAP for short, which is where I work with Teagasc. And I suppose the reason for those two bodies was to implement this on the ground in specific catchments around the country, or priority areas for action they're called, where the LawPro would do some work on the catchment science side of things, basically assessing the streams and assessing the rivers and trying to identify what's impacted them, what's the pressure on them. And if it's an agricultural pressure that's impacting the water quality, well, then that is handed over to the advisory service to engage with the farmers in the area of the river, assess their farms, try and identify if there's any issues impacting water quality, come up with a plan with the farmer. It's a voluntary program, it's a confidential program. So this is very much with the farmers' help and the farmer support, and that we would develop a plan to try and identify the measures and come up with mitigation actions that would improve water quality. And I suppose going back to the collaborative part of it, we're working very closely with LawPro. We're also working very closely with the dairy co-ops. So the dairy co-ops are providing advisors to work with their clients, and Teagasc is working with non-dairy clients in the ASSAP program.
And you mentioned, Noel, that what you're looking at is to have all of your waters in the good to high water status in terms of quality. Where do you see water quality at across the country? And I guess you mentioned catchments, so is there a variation across the country?
Yes, so I suppose what kind of benchmarks where water quality is the EPA bring out water quality reports every 3 years, and the most recent one was brought out in 2019. That covers the period from 2013 to 2018. And they're very in-depth reports, but basically the message from it is that over the past number of years, water quality has been declining, slightly year on year, nothing too dramatic, but it has been declining. And I suppose the best way I can kind of put into context is that the water quality is in around 53% of our surface of our rivers and streams are at good water quality or high water quality. That's broadly similar to what it was back in 95, 97 area, very similar. So, in the intervening time, there's been a lot of money spent in by farmers, and investing in facilities, investing in tanks and so on. And also with Irish Water now putting in for sewage treatment works and so on. And despite all that effort, water quality really hasn't improved. It improved for a while, but has gone back again. And we have to look at what the reasons for that is.
And from an agricultural perspective, Noel, is that, I suppose, stabilisation, regardless of the investment made and a disimprovement in some instance, is that, coming directly from agriculture, or are there other, I suppose, pollutants or enterprises that are having a negative effect on water quality?
Yeah, of course, that's a good question. You have agriculture, you have forestry, you have peat, you have hydromorphology, which is basically straightening and deepening and works that you do in a river. You have wastewater treatment plants, septic tanks, industry. You have all these things that are causing an impact on water quality, all these human activities. But I suppose the one that is impacting the most out there is agriculture. And I suppose, that's because agriculture is the main land use in the country, and it is having an impact. And it's impacting by diffuse losses mainly. So diffuse losses are losses of nutrient or pesticides or things like that at a farm or a field scale, whereas people are probably more familiar with the point source losses, which would be your discharge from a farmyard that would be directly getting into a stream. So what we're finding is it's more around the diffuse losses, and that is very much dependent on the part of the country that you're in. So in certain parts of the country, you have a diffuse nitrogen loss issue, and that would be very much in the free draining, more intensive areas of agriculture, which would be corresponding to the across the south and southeast, where you'd have the more free draining land. And then on the other side, you would have maybe phosphorus and sediment and maybe pesticide losses in the heavier, poorer draining land, along, maybe from the Midwest up to Louth, Meath, Cavan, that kind of area, and over obviously into the west as well, where you'd have higher rainfall and heavier soil. So the problems are different in different parts of the country, but there's no doubt about that it's impacted across all parts of the country, from the Connemara to Donegal to Wexford to Kerry and Cork, so everywhere in between there's areas that are being impacted, and agriculture is having an impact in those areas, I'm afraid.
And to you, Eimear, you're on the ground as an ASSAP advisor, and Noel has explained that farmers are volunteering to I suppose work with you and assess their farm, develop a plan, in terms of how they can mitigate against vulnerabilities in their system. From your perspective, getting out onto farms, what exactly are you seeing as potential areas that are vulnerable to, I guess, losses of, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment that Noel spoke about?
So when we're out on farm, really what we're looking at, it's varying from farm to farm, really, the issues we're finding. But initially, when we go out onto a farm, what we're trying to observe really and establish is where the nutrients and the sediment are being lost to the river network. So we're trying to identify these areas on farm, where the nutrient pathways are, and how can we break them? What can we do to slow down the flow and break the pathway of the nutrients and sediment leaving the farm at various points, like diffuse issues across the farm, and break that pathway from those nutrients and sediment getting into the river network. So we're trying to establish these critical source areas on the farm, and that's kind of critical for us going forward. Our farm assessment then, it will focus on three broad kind of areas. So we're looking at the farmyard and its management, the land and the riparian management, and also then the nutrient management. So when we go into the farmyard, we're looking for things like soil water collection, drain connections and diversion points, if they're not turned the right way, which can often happen and is easily overlooked, just because of the busyness of the farm. We're also looking at there where where nutrients are escaping into drains, and particularly the drain leaving the farmyard. If there's dairy washings or a bit of silage effluent, things like that seep from farmyard manure heaps. where the kind of soil yards, where there's a bit of seep getting from those into drains and leaving the yard. So dairy washing, silage effluent are extremely polluting materials. So a tiny amount of those can have a really damaging effect on a river network. There's also issues then around storage and management of brown bales and farmyard manure storage. So they'd be kind of a very general overview of the things in the farmyard. But once we've gone through the farmyard with the farmer, we go on then and we'll walk the actual farm and the land. So we're looking at the land and riparian management. So what we're focusing on there really are, again, how are nutrients potentially being lost from the farm and getting into open drains, field drains, or otherwise down into groundwater, depending on your soil type and what part of the country you're in. So some of the issues there that we've come across would be field drains that have stone right to the surface. That's a direct pathway for nutrients there. Sacrifice paddocks, cattle access points, rivers not being fenced, buffer zones not being observed. Roadway runoff is one now that's, has come into legislation this year. That's quite a big issue as well. Drinking troughs, where round feeders are placed on rocky outcrops as well. Again, you have a direct pathway there down into groundwater. So again, it's trying to identify these critical source areas out on the farm. So where you have kind of these hydrologically sensitive areas and a nutrient loading, and you have a delivery point then into a drain or into a stream or a river. So it's kind of a focused delivery pathway that we're trying to identify on the farm, and trying to mitigate it then, what can we do to break the pathway? And then we also look then at the nutrient management planning side of things. So just trying to identify mineral versus peat soils, identifying where the water courses are on the farm and where the drains, because the connectivity to the river network is massive across, farms in Ireland, whether you're on free draining soil or whether you're on very heavy soil type. The free draining soil type, you're very much connected to the groundwater, whereas on a heavier soil type, you have a lot of open drains and field drains. So again, your connectivity, even though you may not have a stream or river, actually on your farm, you're still very much connected to it. So there is capacity really on every farm for nutrient loss. And I think really the issue for agriculture with water quality in Ireland is it's death by 1,000 cuts. So there's a little bit been lost from a lot of farms, and that has it has a large cumulative effect. And I suppose the issue with water quality then, it takes such a tiny amount of phosphate to kind of negatively affect the river ecology and the water quality. You're talking a really tiny amount of phosphate that will bring the water quality from high down to good, or from good down to moderate. So, it's really tiny amounts. So we're trying to find the areas on each farm where these nutrients are potentially being lost, and also sediment, because sediment then carries with it an awful lot of nutrients. Nutrients bind to it. So sediment or soil really is, often called the master pollutant because other pollutants bind to it. And sediment is having as much of a negative impact really, if not more, than what we originally thought. So, it's the three key things: nitrate, phosphate, and sediment. The pesticides and coliforms would also be looked at. They're more of an issue for drinking water, but they would still form part of our farm visits. So, and so far farmers have been very positive towards us. They've been very receptive to the farm visits, very obliging, and they're all very interested in what we're saying to them. So I suppose what needs to kind of progress on from that now is probably the mitigation measures, and seeing a lot more of those mitigation measures put in place on farms.
And I guess, Eimear, from what you've said, you've really detailed exactly what you're looking at on farms, and I think it reflects a very holistic view and looking at every aspect of the farmyard and the land. And, I thought it might be a silly question, but you've answered it for me. I was thinking, is it a case that every farm does, have some sort of losses of nutrients, and can every farm contribute? And you've answered that question. But I guess to take that a step further, From a farmer's perspective, if they're in a catchment area that has reduced in water quality status from high to good or good to moderate, as you've mentioned earlier, is there situations where a farmer can identify whether they, a particular farm is, I guess, losing a lot of nutrients, or is it just that you're taking it across a river flow, that it's all farmers, or can you identify, say, an offender within a group of farms?
Yeah, so the catchment scientist teams that we work with in LawPro, they do detailed analysis of the river. So within a catchment that we're working in, they will work on the main channel, but they'll also work on the tributaries. And so if a tributary is showing signs of excess nutrients in it or excess sediment, then we will the catchment scientists will work back up that tributary to try and, narrow down the area that needs to be focused on. So they can get to a stage where they will sample above and below different points in a tributary, and that will narrow the focus, because we'll say above a certain point, everything might be fine, and below a certain point, things are not where they should be. So it certainly can be narrowed and focused. But I think it's important for farmers to know that our work and the work of LawPro is non-regulatory, and it's not, there's no enforcement attached to it, and it's completely voluntary. So engagement with us is a positive thing. Hopefully people will see it that way. Like, we're trying to help them to rectify the issues on their farm, to try and get water quality better in your catchment. And I suppose if you have good water quality in your catchment, then that's a positive for farming in that area. Like, the key message that we really want to get out to farmers is that, like, very simple measures on farm can make a big difference in terms of water quality. So simple changes to management practices, and in particular, I'd say management and farmer kind of behavior or attitude towards water quality, so that the shoulder periods of the year are extremely risky in terms of nutrient loss. So to try and avoid these times if possible. The other thing we see a lot of is the buffer zones not being quite adhered to. So the 5 metre buffer zone for spreading slurry, that applies to drains as well as streams. So anything that can carry water, that buffer zone applies to it. So there's simple things like that, I suppose, that can be done without any cost, and they can have a big impact on water quality.
And I think, Eimear, from what you've said, it's non-regulatory, and it's about informing ourselves, and I think that's a really good point to make. And one thing I've taken from what you've said about what you're looking at when you go out to farms, it's often a fresh pair of eyes are seeing things that may be a problem, but when you see them every day, you don't necessarily see the issue that's in front of you. I guess from a dairy perspective, Eimear, can you identify the top mitigation strategies that you would see as easy wins for farmers? Like you mentioned, things like the buffer zones, there's no, extra cost to doing these things, doing them right as opposed to not doing them so right. But what to you are the top mitigation strategies that dairy farmers can adopt?
So I suppose it's about getting the right measure in the right place. So if I start with the yard, I think I would always do is look at the drain that leaves the farmyard and identify, is there kind of excessive nutrients in that? So is there a bit of algal growth in it? And work your way back into the yard and see, maybe there's a leaky pipe, or maybe there's a diversion point that's not turned the right way. So in the yard, that can often be the case, and the farmer just may not have been aware, just didn't have time to look, or so that has often happened. The correct storage of nutrients, obviously. So when we're doing a farm visit, we're not necessarily checking like slurry storage or anything like that, because that's already there under cross compliance and under nitrates regulations. So we're non-regulatory, so we're looking at just how the nutrients are escaping. In terms of land management, then depending, I suppose, first where you are in the country, if you're in the southeast of the country, on free draining soils, the source control of nitrogen then is a key element. So using the low emission slurry spreading, incorporation of clover, possibly multi-species swards, things like that to help reduce down the amount of chemical fertilizer that's being applied, because in the EPA's report, the levels of nitrate in the south and southeast of the country are, they're quite high. So the reduction of chemical nitrogen per farm, would have a very positive impact on water quality. And by using those new technologies, you should be able to see a reduction in the amount of chemical fertilizer that's being applied. And then I suppose in the wetter, kind of heavier soil types, it would be more things like breaking the pathway. So things that will slow the flow of water. So maybe a hedgerow, planting a new hedgerow in the correct location. Kind of sediment ponds or sediment traps can often be very helpful and beneficial. Riparian margins, so, kind of woody, maybe planting of trees, woody material at certain points. So where there is delivery of nutrients into the river, the location and planting of those trees is really critical. So there's a lot of different things that can be done, but it really is very dependent on where you are in the country, the soil type that's there. I suppose the stocking rate as well has another factor to take into account. But there's a lot of different mitigation measures that can be put in place to help prevent nutrient loss and sediment loss.
And to you, Noel, if we consider, what you've outlined from the outset, and some of the experience that Eimear has from being on farm and seeing exactly what is happening, and I guess the various potential losses. If we ignore water quality as a part of dairy production systems, or the wider agricultural production systems, and we're seeing that the trend for water quality declines, what are the consequences of that for the industry?
Yeah, look, I suppose I suppose we were talking about water quality, but I think there's also a focus on agriculture with regards to biodiversity and greenhouse gases. So I think we have to look at them all in the one kind of glaze, or one gaze. It's not going to go away. I suppose we've been talking about water quality for a long time, and we've tried various bits and pieces to try and improve water quality, and it hasn't just happened, for a number of reasons. And look, our understanding around how nutrients and sediment and phosphorus and pesticides are lost from farms has improved significantly in the last 2 or 3 years from what the work the ASSAP has been doing in conjunction with LawPro. So that's gives us a better idea as to what's impacting on water quality. And I suppose this feeds then into bigger policy items like the nitrates derogation that's on review that's going on there now at the minute. And that is probably the chief mechanism for regulating water quality in Ireland. It's one of the major tools that's in the toolbox from regulators' point of view. And that is probably, there's a derogation there currently at the minute. I'm sure that the department, the EPA, are looking very closely at that, and there may be impacts contained within the new derogation if we get a derogation. It is by no means guaranteed that we'll get one, but I know the department are putting together the case so as that we would get one. But look at I think Eimear made a very good point there. There's lots of things that farmers can do within their control that won't really cost them much money at all, upfront investment. And that is around, particularly for the intensive dairy areas, how they use their nitrogen and needing to get that as efficiently as they can, particularly in that early spring, late autumn period of time, because that's where, you have the lower growth rates, you have the higher rainfall. If you have too much nitrogen out over and above grass growth rates, there's a potential for that nitrogen to get leached away in rainfall. There's a lot of heavy rainfall there in the south of the country, late February. So that can leach away. And in one of the PAs that we're working in, there's on average a bag of can per acre being lost per year off the land in that particular PA in the south of the country. So that's quite a significant loss. So look at that is really, it can impact on regulation that's been planned. So we'll have to wait and see what happens, Emma-Louise. But look, we need to try and do our best as farmers to try and limit the losses. And I know people are doing their best, but we have to try a little bit. New ideas and new things that Eimear spoke about will go a long way to helping.
And I think, from both of your perspectives, some of the practices that you're talking about are going to lead to a reduction in costs, particularly where you're going to increase the value of nitrogen using low emission slurry spreading, or be it using, including white clover, reducing costs in terms of inputs of nitrogen fertilizer, but also then maximising the use of the nitrogen products you have. We can maintain a lot of productivity while altering our system slightly. I guess, tuning into the podcast today, people might be aware this is part of the Water Quality Week, and there are additional podcasts available today. The Environment Edge have a podcast on the topic of water quality, and we will also hear from the Beef Edge on Wednesday. Noel, can you give us some insight into what else we can expect to see and hear during the Water Quality Week?
Yeah, we've obviously with the way COVID is and so on, the traditional kind of events that Teagasc would do weren't the runner this year. So I suppose just because water quality has become such a focus for agricultural industry, we felt we should try and run a water quality week. So what we've done is we've divided the week up into various themes. On Monday, we were looking at water quality and catchment management, and Law Pro will be front and center there. They'll be talking about why water quality is important and how you'd assess water quality. Tuesday is looking at nitrogen and using the inputs efficiently and going through the things that Eimear would have mentioned there. Wednesday, the focus is on phosphorus and sediment loss and trying to break that pathway and looking at critical source areas and buffer zones and things like that. On Thursday, we're looking at the losses or the impacts that pesticides can have. So you're looking at sprays in CPA and rushes, and also sheep dip and foot baths and things like that can also impact on particularly on drinking water quality. On Friday, then we're looking at farmyards and how they are managed and the things to watch out for, as Eimear would have outlined. And there's other bits and pieces thrown in there. We'll have some from some farmers on with farmer testimonials, and we'll be looking at projects like the Pearl Mussel project and wetlands for water and agroforestry. There's lots of little different bits and pieces there that we'll be pushing out, and they're all going to be sent out through Teagasc digital media, your Twitter, your Facebook, your Instagram, short videos, and there'll be, short articles just to give it a little bit of explanation around it. It'll be on Teagasc Daily and the Teagasc website. And, if anybody wants to catch up on stuff, it'll all be on www.teagasc.ie/water quality week. All right, so that's where you'll get it. If you Google that, you'll get all the information there.
And we'll attach that link to the show notes. And look, I mean, you've outlined what the Water Quality Week will entail, and I'm sure particular days will strike a note with farmers as to what they're interested in or what they need to brush up on. We're looking forward to seeing what the week has in store. Thank you, Noel and Eimear.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emma-Louise. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Noel Meehan and Eimear Connery for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma-Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.